She said it with a laugh, the kind of laugh that's meant to sound light, meant to sound harmless, the kind people use when they want to say something cruel without being held responsible for it. We were standing in my son's living room. There were guests, neighbors, colleagues, a couple I had never met before. Someone had asked how the family arrangement worked, me living nearby, the children, the holidays. And my daughter-in-law, Diane, smiled and said, "Oh, Eleanor, she's kind of our charity case." A few people laughed. My son said nothing. I stood there holding a glass of lemonade, and I smiled the way you do when something lands like a stone but you refuse to let anyone watch you sink. I excused myself quietly, walked to the kitchen, set my glass down on the counter, and I thought about a building. But before I take you back to that evening and everything that followed, I want to know where you are right now. Drop your location in the comments. Somehow, knowing someone else is out there listening makes these stories easier to tell. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 71 years old. For most of my adult life, I was two things simultaneously: a devoted wife and a quiet business woe. Man, not the kind you read about in newspapers, the kind who makes careful decisions in the background, signs papers in an attorney's office, and then goes home to cook dinner without mentioning any of it. My husband, Robert, was a high school history teacher. He loved his work in the way only certain people love their work completely, without ambition for anything beyond it. He didn't want to be a principal. He didn't want to write books. He wanted to stand in front of a classroom and make 17-year-olds care about the past. And he did, for 31 years. I was the one who worried about money, not because we were poor. Robert's salary was modest but steady, and I had worked as a bookkeeper for a regional firm since my late 20s. Numbers made sense to me in a way that most other things didn't. I understood how money moved, how it grew, how it could be made to work quietly in the background if you were patient enough. In 1987, I bought a property. It wasn't glamorous. A 4-unit apartment building on the east side of the city near the industrial district. At the time, the neighborhood was run down and nobody wanted it. Robert thought I was being optimistic. I thought I was being mathematical. The rent from those 4 units covered the mortgage within 2 years. Within 10, the building had tripled in value. I bought a second one in 1994. Robert never objected, but he also never fully tracked the details. He trusted me completely with our finances, the same way I trusted him to handle everything involving the children's education. We had divided the invisible labor of our marriage along those lines for 30 years, and it worked. Our son Daniel grew up knowing we were comfortable. He did not grow up knowing exactly why. That distinction would matter later. Daniel was a gentle child who became an impatient adult. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's true, and because I spent many years making excuses for it when I should have simply acknowledged it. He married Diane 11 years ago. She was sharp, well-dressed, and completely certain about everything. She had opinions about wine and school districts and the correct way to load a dishwasher. Robert used to say, quietly, that Diane reminded him of a calculator always arriving at an answer, rarely showing the work. I tried to build a relationship with her. I brought food with. And she was pregnant. I watched the children when they needed help. I attended every birthday, every school play, every Sunday dinner I was invited to. But Diane had a way of managing me. That's the only word for it. She was never openly cruel. She was managing. Every interaction had a slight edge of administration to it, as though I were a task on her list rather than a person in her life. When Robert died 3 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the way he would have wanted Diane's management of me became more visible. She began making small comments about how I was coping, about whether I was okay on my own, about whether my apartment was practical for someone my age, about the neighborhood, the stairs, the distance from the family. The comments were always wrapped in concern, but concern, I have learned, can be used as a leash. I listened. I nodded. I did not mention the building 2 miles from their house that I had owned for 19 years. After Robert died, I saw Daniel and Diane more often. Diane would arrive at my apartment sometimes unannounced, looking around the way people do when they're cataloging. She rearranged things in my kitchen once while I was in the other, a room. When I came back, she smiled and said she was just tidying. I said nothing. A few months later, Daniel sat me down and suggested I consider moving closer to them. Diane had researched some options, he said. Smaller places, more manageable, better suited to, and he paused to where I was in life. I was 68 years old with 2 investment properties, a healthy savings account, and more energy than either of them, but I understood what he meant. I told him I would think about it. What I actually did was call my property manager and ask how the buildings were performing. Very well, she said. Better than ever. Good, I said. Let's keep it that way. I did not move. I stayed in my apartment. But the invitations to Sunday dinners continued, and I continued to accept them because whatever Diane thought of me, my grandchildren Lily and James were worth every uncomfortable hour at that table. It was at one of those dinners 6 months later that Diane began explaining to their neighbor couple how the family worked, and that was when she called me a charity case. I stayed in the kitchen for about 3 minutes, long enough for my face to return to something new, neutral, long enough to make a decision. When I walked back into the living room, the conversation had moved on. Diane was talking about a renovation they were planning. New flooring throughout the ground level, she said. They'd been quoted a significant number and were weighing their options. I sat down. I listened. I asked one question. Which unit are you in again? The second floor? Diane looked at me with the patient expression she reserved for questions she found slightly below her. No, Eleanor. Ground floor. We've been here 4 years. I nodded slowly. I know, I said. I meant which unit in the building. She smiled the way people smile at the very elderly. It's a house, Eleanor, not a building. I opened my purse and found a business card. I placed it on the coffee table in front of her. That's my property manager, I said. Her name is Patricia. You'll want to contact her before you make any changes to the flooring. Structural alterations require written approval from the owner. The room went very quiet. Diane stared at the card, then at me. What does that mean? She asked. It means, I said pleasantly, that I own this building. All 4 units, including the one you've been renting for. Or 4 years. What followed was not a fight. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable than a fight. Diane looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the business card. The neighbors found a reason to check on something in the hallway. Lily and James, bless them, were in the other room entirely. Daniel spoke first. Mom. His voice was careful in the way people are careful around something that might shatter. You own this building. Yes. Since when? Since 2004. I bought it the year Lily was born, actually. I remember because I used the closing date to calculate whether I could still make her baptism on time. I could. Diane set down her glass. You never told us. Number. Why not? I looked at her for a moment. Then I said something I had been composing in my kitchen for the past 10 minutes. Because a woman's financial life is her own, Diane. I didn't think it required an announcement, but she started. I stood up slowly. I think what I'll do, I said, is head home. It's been a long evening. I'll let Patricia know you may be in touch about the floors. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not even satisfaction exactly. Something quieter, a kind of settled. Clarity, the feeling of having finally stood on ground that was always yours and simply choosing to stand on it. Daniel called the next morning. He apologized for Diane's comment. He sounded genuinely ashamed. I told him the apology was his to give, not Diane's to avoid, and that what had bothered me more than her words was his silence while she spoke them. He didn't answer immediately, and sometimes a silence is the most honest response a person can give. We talked for a long time that morning. About Robert, about the buildings, about all the things I had managed quietly for decades that Daniel had never thought to ask about what it meant to assume that someone needed saving simply because they were old or widowed or living alone. As for Diane, she called Patricia that week. Professional, correct, and brief. The flooring request was approved. I charged standard processing fees. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes with age. People look at you and see what they expect: someone slower, someone softer, someone who needs to be managed and guided and spoken about in the third person at dinner parties. They rarely think to ask what you built before they arrive. Ed. Robert used to say that the most dangerous assumption a person could make was that quiet meant empty. He wasn't wrong. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And tell me something else. Where are you listening from today? What time is it where you are right now? These stories are for every woman who ever smiled through something that should have required an apology. You are not invisible. You never were. If this resonated with you, please subscribe. There are many more stories waiting about dignity, about patience, and about the quiet power of knowing exactly what you own.